Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
What news, Steph, apart from your new haircut and your new camera?
Yeah, well, that's a lot. Isn't that enough? I have a new webcam and I got a new haircut a week ago, and it's still settling in. I can't stand new haircuts. Other than that, my kids were away last week at their grandparents, and now they're back. Some resettling into that. That's about all.
Does that mean an increase in stress with the kids coming back?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like the topic for this episode is very apt then.
Yeah.
And just for those people listening on the podcast, we are live streaming this episode into our community group. So we are joined by some community members who are going to offer their input as well.
Hi, everybody.
Do we need to do the usual then when we start and say what we're talking about? And we're talking about stress because it's one of those words that's big and means different things to different people.
How do you define it without looking?
The first things that came into my mind is that belief that you can't cope. So I think stress is a lot to do with our reaction to something. We talk about stressful situations, and I think there are a lot of situations that many of us would agree is stressful, but stress itself is our response to any situation.
As opposed to a stressor, right? Like the stressor is the event, the objective event, and the stress is the reaction to it.
Yes.
So you can cope with a stressor, but not be coping with your stress.
Yes. When I was doing a bit of Googling, which was the extent of my research for this episode, there's a lot of talk about stress also being a good thing. And have you heard the word eustress?
Eustress?
Yes.
Can you spell it?
Yeah, it's spelled EU and then stress.
Like European stress?
It makes me think of eugenics for some reason, which is not
what is eustress?
It's basically like that positive stress, the stress that leads to positive change, positive action. The whole idea behind evolution is that things develop and grow as a result of stresses, right?
Yes. We have stress for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
It leads us to change and action. Same like anger. Like there's some purpose.
But I think when we're talking about stress eating, we're talking about that kind of stress that leads us to think, I can't cope. I don't want to feel like this. I can't bear feeling like this. And I'm reaching for food to try not to feel like this. That's how I'm thinking about it. Does that?
Yeah, right. That's typically, I think, how we're talking about it when it comes to food. But it's interesting to bring up the concept because it also maybe inside of that stress is the judgment that we shouldn't be feeling it or that it's bad to be feeling it. Where is that line crossed from productive stress to non-productive stress?
Yeah, what feels bearable? And, we could talk about window of tolerance and all of that. But when I was thinking about this episode and I was thinking about my own stress, when I think of the word stress, I tend to think of tension, anxiety, like a lot of energy that almost wants to burst out. That's what my mind does with the idea.
Yeah.
But when I think about how I experience stress, I think I have much more, it's like a shutdown response. So I don't think I always know that I'm stressed. The other kind of stress feels to me like the stress that speaks and makes itself known.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that's where I tend to then experience a kind of vague agitation.
I think of both of it at once. Like when I'm talking about, stress, I have a lot. Well, it depends what kind, right? So I have the kids overwhelm stress where it's like noise, volume, expectation, needs, like too many things to do, which does give that activation, that energy one that you're speaking of. But then I quickly can go into shutdown from it. Right. So they both almost feel like they can be happening at once. It does make it difficult to pinpoint that you're in it. I think because sometimes we are imperceptibly moving from high activation, which is the propulsion to act. That's productive in a way. But then if it's too much, if we're exceeding our window of tolerance, we're going into this. I need to escape this. I need to escape this to cope with this. And I think maybe it's helpful to talk about kinds of stress because there's also when I have work stress, it's quiet. It's like just me and myself and there's no noise necessary. It's busy here. And in here. And then I still have the shutdown response, but it looks totally different than external stress from like children or whatever. Like what other kinds? What do we experience stress from?
The first one that comes to my mind, I think, is health for me. I think
Hmm.
is one of the biggest stressors in my life. Um,
Really?
yeah, yeah, I
Hmm.
do. I feel like my body doesn't do all the things I would want it to do, and quite often there's pain here, and yeah. So I have pain and I have health conditions that I manage, and that is probably what I would put up there as number
Hmm.
one. In terms of others, there isn't anything else that particularly comes to mind, and maybe this is a bit of a blind spot for me. I'm not sure. But I look at my work and I think, I don't feel stressed about my work. I tell you why I always think of myself as not a stressed person, because I feel like big picture stuff, I don't feel overly invested with the outcome. So there are things that I want and hope for from different
Mm.
perspectives in my life, but I'm open to those things not happening. So
Yeah.
therefore, I don't feel that sense of stress and clinging.
Mhm.
The kind of things that probably make me feel stressed are the smaller things. And maybe it's, I don't know, some kind of projection away because I can't control the bigger things, that it shows up in the smaller things.
Mhm.
So time is probably a stressor for me. Lateness, fitting things in. Occasionally, I have those moments where I look at my diary and it looks so full that I have that moment of tension of like, I
Yeah.
haven't given myself room to breathe, even though when I'm doing those things, I'm having a really good time
Uh-huh.
doing them on the whole.
Uh-huh.
And then if I give myself these gaps, sometimes I don't know what to do with them. So those are the things I think that come to mind for me around stress.
I relate. Um, as you were talking, I was thinking, because I was thinking, Sarah, stress. And I was thinking, you get stressed when you're lonely. But then I was thinking, perhaps stress to me in my personal definition, and I think it would be interesting to look it up. But my personal definition of it is an emotion that I don't have the capacity to cope with. So it's not necessarily about the work itself. It's about my overwhelm inside of that work or my underwhelm, if like with the empty time. Stress occurs to me anytime I have an emotion that I can't sit with. And then whatever spills out is stress. It becomes this energy in my body. I talk about a lot of things as energy in the body. This is how I see it. I really conceptualize that way.
Well, I was looking at the mental health websites because I felt like that just felt more relevant because there are so many different ways people are talking about it. So Mind, that's one of the leading mental health charities here in the UK, says that stress is how we react when we feel under pressure or threatened. It usually happens when we're in a situation that we don't feel we can manage or control. So that to me is the overwhelming kind of stress. We're not talking about eustress there. And then mentalhealth.org.uk says stress is a feeling of being overwhelmed or unable to cope with a mental or emotional pressure. Stress can be defined as any type of change that causes physical, emotional, or psychological strain. See, there's lots of different ways people are talking about it.
So here's my question as it wraps back around to this to food. What is a helpful way of dealing with stress or in your mind what's the goal?
Do you want to hear some of the amazing advice that I found
Yeah.
in the internet when I was looking at how to manage stress? Let's just see what you think of these, get your reactions. Go for a walk.
Sometimes that increases stress. I don't have time to go for a walk.
But sometimes, and on the flip side of that, sometimes, certainly for me, getting up and moving my body and walking does have that kind of calming effect from a
Yeah,
bilateral place.
totally.
But it's almost like with stress, there needs to be a bit of space,
Yes.
acknowledgement, and
Yes.
like almost the resources to be able to
Yes,
do
which is
something about
inherently
it.
stressful. It's
It
interesting
can be
because as you said it,
stressful.
I'm like, "Of course walking helps me, it does." But the
Yeah.
second I get advice about that or
Mm,
think of like, "This is what I should do," I'm like, "Heck no, you don't understand my stress." You don't
yeah.
understand, like, it makes me resentful.
Yeah. Do you want to hear the next one?
Mhm.
Having a warm cup of tea.
That doesn't please me.
Plus, you can't do that without an electric kettle, can you? For anyone who missed it before, I don't know if it was on the podcast or whether it was outside of the podcast, just in the community, we're talking about how apparently in America it's just not commonplace to have an electric kettle, which just blows the mind of us Brits.
Well, some people do. From that conversation, there were people that popped in saying, "No, I have one and I live in the States."
Mhm.
But I don't. It's not calm. It's not you don't
Yeah,
have to.
yeah.
Anyway, yes. Again, stressful to make a cup of tea if I don't have an electric kettle. Gotta get the pots out.
I think there's something you said though, when it's like as soon as someone gives you advice in that moment of stress, if you hear it from somebody else, why don't you go for a walk? I
Yeah.
just want to go, oh,
Yeah.
get in the bin. Shut up. That doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
That doesn't help me. But if I were to think of it myself,
Yes.
it could be useful.
Yes, I think that's something to note.
Hmm.
I think the same thing. I think everything's in delivery, not from someone else, but how we maybe to our own self. Like, I also find sometimes that when I hear someone give me advice, uh, verbally, it rings so differently than if it's written.
Hmm.
When I see something, well, depending.
Yeah. Do you want to hear another
Yeah,
humzinger about managing stress eating? You ready
yeah.
for this one? It's a good one.
Mm.
Brush your teeth.
That sounds like a food one, like brush your teeth so you don't stress eat.
Yeah, it was. But it also sounds very like, I don't know, don't eat, eating's bad, right?
Right, right. That's what I mean.
When we did a podcast episode about stress eating, there's an assumption in there that we need to stop this.
Yeah.
Where's the line then between when eating may be actually a very viable way of managing some stress and when
Hmm.
it's not helping so much?
Consciousness, I think, at least at some point of onset, where you're choosing it. Or you're doing it and you're like, "Oh, I didn't choose that, but I'm doing it and I'm conscious of it now." Because I'll use it. I'll knowingly stress eat sometimes and I'm like, "Okay, this is helping me in this moment. It's all I can do it right now." Um, but then that consciousness itself is kind of like, "Okay, like that would turn into something non-productive for me. So what else do I need to do?" Because it can catapult, it can become a slippery slope. So that awareness to me is a really big part of it.
Yeah. And also for me, that idea is the eating itself causing more stress?
Yeah.
That's
Eventually, or when it turns into.
well, for a lot of people, they would say that disordered eating like is the source of stress in their life, perhaps one
Mhm,
of the big
mhm.
ones. Do you think that lack of stress can be a stressor?
Sometimes when your stress hormones are built to activate on a regular basis, lack of stress to me for a long time and still to some degree is like, "Uh-oh, now I gotta wait for the other shoe to drop," which increases stress. So if things are quiet and calm for too long, there's a bit of like it can only go down from here. Like when's it coming? So I'll activate my own stress pattern, which
Mhm.
I think a lot of times what I do with anxiety, I create my own so that it feels okay. I'm handling like it feels safe in a way. I learned that there's safety in stress for me because I grew up that way.
Yeah. That for me, that emptiness, I think can be there's something really uncomfortable in that. And almost, I suppose we were talking about stress as an I can't cope moment. There've definitely been times where those empty moments have felt like I can't cope with this empty moment.
Yeah.
It's been too uncomfortable to just stay in that.
Well, then food is a good filler, right?
Mhm.
I think I've done that a lot in my life where the emptiness is too empty and food gives you something to do. It gives you a distraction from that for sure. Even where you don't want to be doing it. Also because it doesn't seem to make logical sense that like no stress, like sometimes I think that doesn't compute where it's like things are fine. There's nothing actively wrong. So why do I need why am I having this compulsion to eat right now? Why do I need this distraction? Everything's fine. But it's kind of like, well, under that might be this, well, the emptiness itself might be stressful or the unstress might be stressful. Knowing that, and I think naming it can be helpful as far as saying, like, okay, that's what I'm dealing with, rather than having it be a mystery, sort of. I think a lot of times we eat because we don't understand why we want to eat or what's going on there. Can you recall a time that what the absence of stress might have felt like, even if it was a long time ago? Because I think contrasting things is helpful to know what something is.
Yeah.
If there is a memory of a time of having no stress, what did it feel like? How is it different physically in the body? How is it experienced differently in the body?
I was thinking about, especially if you've got a life that is quite overwhelming, that stress gives you a certain amount of energy, right? That's the supposed to be the positive part of stress.
Mhm.
And I know for me, certainly when I've had deadlines or things looming, I've always wanted to be that person that finishes way before the deadline, and I'm not. But I'm also not the person that works right up to the deadline because that's too stressful as well. And when I was at university, this used to frustrate me. I was like, why can't I just get my essays out of the way? And once I realized actually this gives me some energy,
Mm.
I just accepted it and went with it. And I
Yeah.
know that this is what I do. I'm gonna get it done.
Also, I think sometimes we think about de-stressing, like, for example, having a cup of tea. Not walking, walking's different, but having a cup of tea or those common, like, what you should do to calm yourself down, it's too much of a transition, and that to me is stressful. Transitioning is really stressful to me. So if I'm in a heightened state of stress, And the thought of calming down means meditating or like going and even taking a break, like in quiet. Like to me, it's like I can't move from to ah. Like to me, it doesn't feel right. So, building off what you're saying, redefining what managing stress might be, it might not be calming down to silence or to stillness. It might be actually movement still having some kind of activation, but just in a more productive way or within the window of tolerance. So, for me, this looks like I experience stress as like it's really associated for me with anxiety. So it's this like buzzing fast, my head's going like this, my heart's probably racing, I'm like moving a lot, even if that's mentally. And if I have caffeine, by the way, it's even worse. So there's times where I really caught physically like, oh, I'm in a stress state where it's like, oh, I'm spilling over the point of which this is productive for me. Calming down is going to be too much. It's too drastic of a shift. So what I need to do is just bring myself, I just need to dial my energy back just a bit, but not a lot. So that I slide right back into that window of tolerance where I am in that productive place and then I'm getting work done. I'm able to stay motivated and use the momentum of the energy to keep me going rather than to stop and halt and kind of then I'm more prone to like fold in on myself. um, so to me, it's like, okay, keep moving, but move a little bit slower. Talk. I do this a lot. I talk slower. Because I talk really fast, which is another way that I show anxiety, which by the way can be productive. I think that's what you stress might be. Like when I talk fast on a podcast, I'm not unhappy. I'm not feeling stressed. I'm just there's an excitement energy. And so slowing down a little, doing something a little like it's just a dial back. I think this speaks to the black and white again, where I think managing stress could be a lot less effortful than we might think it is. It's just a little bit of a scale back to slide back into a place where the energy is okay. It's still there. It's just not overwhelming.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
This is how I often get the questions about stress eating coming at me from various people who might send me questions. They'll say something.
I love when we're live.
They'll say something along the lines of, how do I stop eating when I'm stressed? Because actually managing the stress doesn't either seem possible, or it's kind of bouncing off a comment that's gone in the chat, or the circumstances aren't going to change. There are the things that people live with that really are a constant source, a constant stressor in their life. So is it possible to live with this stress and be able to not stress eat, but without eliminating or reducing the stress?
Yeah, to a degree. I think I used to come at this from the point of view of I want to stop stress eating or eating to cope. And that is a big leap from where I was. So I don't think I ever offered myself the option of I'd like to be more conscious of my stress eating and stress eat a little less and use other coping. Like it was it was very all or nothing. And I still sometimes do stress eat. And the permission to do that is helpful because I don't have to be so vigilant that I never need that. Like I can't do that because there is a lot of stress around, externally and internally. And so I think it's maybe just about being a little bit more soft in the approach and not necessarily expecting that you're going to go from 100 to 0. But I think you can learn to be more conscious of it. One of the things I often suggest to do is to build in other coping skills alongside of the eating so you don't feel like you're taking anything away where that's going to be threatening. It's kind of like, can you explore other ways of coping with that stress or experimenting with that stress, knowing that food is there for you and that's a safety blanket you may need as you explore, instead of just jumping into like, I can't eat, I need to drink a cup of tea instead, where that's going to be like, that's going to be like, no, it's not only is it going to be feel like that tea doesn't do the trick because it doesn't feel embodied yet as a response. But it's also like, well, now you're taking away a way that I find safety in this, which I think is too much.
I think, and I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody, but it's just my belief system that as long as you really believe that binge eating or using food, and I don't mean just the kind where you eat and you feel a bit better and it was a sort of soothing experience and you move on, because I would still do that with food. But for as long as you think that the binge eating is helping with whatever the big source of stress is, I think it will be very difficult to break. For me, I really thought that using binge eating as an escape was helping me in some way. And sometimes we talk about it like it is, it's performing a function. But there was also a part where that story kind of fell away a bit for me. This belief that actually this food behavior is somehow helping me cope, when actually it was contributing to my feelings of not coping, because it had become such a big problem in my life
Yeah.
that giving it up felt like I wouldn't cope by giving it up either. There were some belief changes that needed to come around that. I have never been as stressed and unhappy as I was when I was struggling with binge eating since,
Yeah.
no matter what happens.
Yeah.
So the thought that that was somehow making life better, that whatever I was going through was so awful, it didn't take away anything I was going through. It gave me a moment reprieve where all the stress and the feelings got shoved down and then they just came up again with more force, with a whole load of shame on top because of how out of control I was with food.
Yeah. But to me,
Mm.
that line of thinking is slippery because then you can start blaming yourself. And then you're adding to your stress because if it was as easy as saying this isn't helpful to me, it was never enough to stop it. So,
No, and that's what I mean by the story kind of fell away. We can't just convince ourselves of something
yeah.
that's doesn't feel true as well. But also, I felt like to not acknowledge that part might miss an opportunity to take some empowerment from that. This is where it's like, where do you go to self blame? And where does something feel blaming? And where does it feel
Yeah.
empowering?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
often things could feel blaming.
Yes.
And a lot of the lessons and things that I feel like I've learned, that finding a way to communicate them without people feeling like that this is some kind of self blame thing is the challenge.
Yeah.
Because I really believe that everyone's doing the best they can based on what they're thinking, believing, and feeling in that moment. As Byron Katie says, all we're ever guilty of is believing our thoughts. That's the challenge, because that's not somebody telling you. Someone can tell you something and you can go, yeah, that kind of sounds true. But until we realize something for ourselves, it doesn't change at the cellular level.
Yeah. I think part of that is taking something in as information rather than as guilt, which we talked about in a previous episode.
There's a question here that came in a little bit earlier. You were kind of alluding to it a little bit when you were talking about anxiety and stress crossing over. And the question is that anxiety disorder thing or just learned behavior?
Say the question again.
It says, so is stress from these things an anxiety disorder thing or
Yeah.
just learned behavior?
I have a way that I approach my theory of stress. So I'll offer that. So I have anxiety disorder. Um, and I don't think it's all learned. I think that I have a predisposition to it. I really relate that to my nervous system. I have a lower capacity for stress because I have a sensitive nervous system. Um, and I have factors that sort of make my window along my life that have made my window smaller. M When I have more anxiety and my anxiety disorder shows up more strongly, my window of tolerance is much lower because I've got added stressors on top. Like, when I moved into this house in November, huge stress that I didn't even recognize was going to affect me the way that it did, but my window of tolerance was so small that any little thing was activating me into anxiety and stress. Like, the smallest things I can handle today, like having a puppy, I could never have handled back then because my window was so low. So stress is to me a reflection of where your nervous system is and where your window of tolerance is. And I think that for some people we have genetically or biologically smaller windows of tolerance, and then added stressors make that smaller and smaller and smaller. So for me, my anxiety management at this point, which I'm working on actively this year, is learning how to increase my window of tolerance so that I have more capacity for stressors. And that's how I play with it. But my anxiety disorder plays into that because my window is something I have to manage. It's very sensitive. Whereas someone without anxiety disorder may not have such a narrow window as I do. I've always perceived my window to be really small. Whether that's due to nature or nurture, I think it's both. Because I think I've said this before. My oldest daughter, when she was born, like days old, was on high alert. Like a car would drive by, and it's like her system was very, very sensitive and still is. And my mom told me I was a similar way. So I think there is this plus then the environment and making this narrower. Anyway, I think we have some control over that and learning techniques to regulate it more. And I don't think we can say that we have absolute control or that we have no control. I think it's both true. And I have medication has helped me also, which shows a biological component as well. But without the techniques and tools that I use, it tends to be smaller, even with the medication. So I think that there's both at play.
Mhm.
I don't know if that answered it.
I think I've got a yes, Steph, with an exclamation mark. Yes, Steph.
All right. Who's that from?
That's from Laurie.
Hi, Lori. Thanks, Lori.
Yeah. I think it's very easy. When I was looking at tips, stopping stress eating tips, my mind was very judgmental, very critical about how banal they were. So maybe we could think about what would our tips be? How would we
Yeah.
um, offer something that perhaps is a little bit more useful, just given in mind, obviously, our audience. And one of the ones that came to mind for me actually is if you are going through a stressful period, there's a lot of stresses in your life, is to try to reduce the number of extra decisions you have to make in a day. So we know that stress affects like our higher executive thinking centers. They go offline, our fight or flight's more easily activated. So even from a food perspective, just having foods in that you can easily prepare and have and having ideas for meals, I think can be a real source of support rather than trying to figure things out as you go along if you've already got a lot of stress going on for you. That for me feels like something quite practical
That's a
that
good one. I concur. I like that it's not you don't have to do it in the moment of stress. It's actually like a it's preparing for the stress.
yeah,
Preventative.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I do again, this is one that's not going to go for everyone, but for me, there's something about changing my physical energy. If I'm feeling stressed, or even if I'm feeling shut down, sometimes like sort of, I have more of experience of like my energy sort of dropping, and it feels like it just falls away, and I just want to sink into not like a peaceful stillness, but like the collapse that I was talking about. And so for me, making sure that I get up and move around, even if it's just pottering, even if it's just
Mhm.
getting up and putting some washing
Yeah.
away, whatever it might be. That's not to say, oh, this is what I would do in like a binge. I'd be like, oh, I could just get up and move around and that would have made it vanish because
No.
it wouldn't. But in terms of paying attention to how my body feels, sometimes when I want to just curl up, what I actually need is to expand from a body perspective.
That plays off what I would say. I think that conceptualizing stress as energy has been really helpful to me. Noticing if that stress is showing up as a sinking, as you say. Did you say sinking? Like a depletion of energy or as a rising of energy and noticing that. And then thinking of what is your body asking you to do with it? And I think that could go in two directions. Your body might be asking to pull down and pull back and to sink with it, or it might need the opposite to kind of counter it. And I think this is context dependent. And vice versa, where the energy is of bubbling over, your body might be saying, "Get some out." Like that, where that walk or that energy movement. I wash dishes a lot when I feel that way. It gets my hands scrubbing, and like there's something in that movement that is like, yeah, I need to move with that energy and move some of it out. And other times, I need to do the exact opposite and slow it down and bring it, in. But but being able to notice that up or down and paying attention to that from this physical viewpoint is been really helpful rather than intellectualizing stress. So, and I think to your other point, nothing works unless you know it works or feel it works. So again, maybe if it's for someone's tried having tea And it's been amazing. It's worked really well. And to them, it's like, no, that's really good advice. Or going for a walk, which I would actually like. I do that when I can, when I have the resources to, and it really does help. And I can only say that, and I would only be able to use that information because I know it. Not know it, I know it because I've done it. Oh, for anyone not watching, I know it in my head. I don't feel it in my body, or I do. There's two different kinds of knowing there. And I think when we know something through our body because we've experienced something, that's the helpful. That could be a helpful way of following what works for you by knowing that it has worked for you, or knowing how that feels versus just hearing that it might.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
And I also wanted to just add in the point of, if you're restricting or undereating, that is a stressor on the body.
Yeah.
So your body is already in this stressed state. You're producing more cortisol. So therefore, it can feel like any bigger stresses tip you over the edge. And then the thing that stressed you out is getting the blame. And it's like, no, it wasn't restriction because this stressful thing happened. And that was why I went to eat. So therefore, it's the thing that happened and not because there's any restriction going on.
Definitely. So my daughter she has lower blood sugar issues a bit. So she needs to eat when she wakes up in the morning. And if she doesn't, her sisters will stress her out in a second. So today this happened, and she was getting ready for camp, and then I don't know, my middle one did something, and she was like, blah, 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 blah. And then I was like, Jules, we need to eat. We need to eat. So she ate her breakfast, and it was like the Snickers commercial, where she's like, all of a sudden she's like, Alex, what was that? She's just a completely different person. And it was a good example of her body was under stress, actually. And she, I know that I can tell her signs of low blood sugar. We don't perceive that intellectually necessarily, but the body is feeling something. And then every little thing's like that. Or if in the case, if you've ever been hungry and then you eat, and then all of a sudden you can think straight. There are physical stressors that are happening, but through, and restriction is a huge culprit of that always worth mentioning.
Yeah. And another one, which has been a bit of a reframe for me, was before my binging could be triggered by stress, and it came from that I can't cope place. I'm going to eat because I can't cope with this, whatever this is in that moment. And the difference now could be, all right, I've been feeling stressed, or I've not been feeling great, or whatever, and I need just a little bit of joy, a little bit of something that is good and tastes good and is an enjoyable experience. And that would be more how I would use food now, which is nothing like how I would turn to it then. And I think there's some confusion around, oh, well, we should only be eating when we're hungry, and we shouldn't be eating for any emotional reasons. It pivoted, it changed. That it was really about an enjoyable experience with the food, because I needed an enjoyable experience because I was just feeling depleted or overwhelmed, as opposed to I can't cope with feeling overwhelmed or depleted, therefore I have to eat. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think that's something that can't be forced either. I think that happens, like that switch happens as you navigate the food relationship and your own awareness of self and your own emotions and your energies.
So there's an interesting comment from earlier from Laurie, where she said, when I'm highly stressed, I can handle that in the moment. Later, I may not know what hit me, and then I want to eat, sometimes days later.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're designed to get through a moment, right? Like our adrenaline surges. We have these hormones that help us cope with stress. But then the come down from that is like, that's when the dust settles, and that's where the effects of that stress really start to show, because then all of a sudden that adrenaline comes down. And, I hear that from a lot of people, that in the heat of the moment, there's this like real capacity to deal with the stress and to know what to do and to act and but that's adaptive. And then it doesn't mean that, I think what happens is you're like, I handled that really well. It's like, well, the handling part's not over. It can come in later.
Yeah. And also in that moment of stress, sometimes your attention is taken off by something else, and you're in task mode and doing mode and fixing mode. And then the come down from the stress, right? I don't know, do we get a cortisol crash? Why not? We get a cortisol crash. I'm just going to make up biology as I go along, which then makes us want to eat more, Steph. That's a fact.
Of course, it has something to do with that.
Yeah.
That's funny. I'm just thinking when I think about stress eating.
Mm.
We know I said I wash dishes. There's something about the repetitiveness and the texture, like the feel, like it's very soothing. And, like that's part of, I think, why food is such a good go-to for stress. Cause it's like, it's doing, it's feeling, it's crunching, and you can just keep moving rather than that stillness. So it makes sense.
Yeah. So you use it and you do something like that, which is constructive or housework. And I put on some Luke Bega and jump around in my lounge for a bit.
That's 'cause P.S. If we had had this podcast pre-kids, it would be such a different podcast because I did not behave this way. I was much more depressed and down and low and slow before having kids. Um, and then once I started having kids, like doing dishes now is a go-to. Whereas like if you told me that 15 years ago, I would have laughed at you. Everyone would have laughed at you.
Yeah. It's something I really got back into in the last month, actually, is just putting on a song and just dancing. I used to do it a lot, a long time ago. And in the last month, I've started doing it. I'll get like a 10-minute window, sometimes between clients and they're back to back. And I would use that occasionally for a power nap because it just felt like this recharge and this kind of letting go. And actually, I've switched it up and I now put on a song. Sometimes I get 2 songs in, and I just move around and it feels really good. You know, you're working with people's emotions and with some quite heavy stuff, and it just
I want to ask you what your songs of choice are first.
I don't even know if I want to tell you on the podcast. I might have to tell you later.
That's interesting. Now I'm more intrigued.
Uh.
Fine. But I also, it's calling to mind the feeling of sometimes when you're in that stress state and you think of things like this, like put on a song and dance, it might make you feel better, but there's a resistance to doing it. It's just like, no. And I think I've grappled with that a lot. Like, why do I not use my things I know work? I think it's, again, that transitioning. It's like sometimes I feel like your brain is adapted to say, like, no, you need to focus on this stress. You need to stay in this stress state so you pay attention. And the thought of coming out of it is almost like the brain's not on board necessarily. Maybe that's a function of anxiety too. If you deal with anxiety, that there's that sort of faulty messaging of like, if you don't stay stressed, you're going to miss something and then something bad will happen. So part of that is awareness as well. For me, I sometimes have to be like, no, that's not true. I have to come out of that idea, which isn't an idea really. It's just a feeling. And remind myself that it's safe to dance. Like that's okay. It will make me feel better, but that's good. There's really no bear outside of the cave anymore. My life is not really threatened if I stop paying attention.
I think for me, it's about intention as well. So I've been very intentional in the last month of looking at other ways to take care of my energy. Because I very much felt like my life force has just been low recently, probably for the last year or two. I'm in a place where I really feel like I'm getting a lot of that back. So I'm being so intentional about fostering that. I will put a song on and, even if I'm just moving my shoulders in my chair, I'll want to get up, but I do it as kind of a bare minimum type thing. If I was going to say to myself, okay, you have to get up between every client and dance to 2 songs, never going to do it. I'm really trying things out because that matters to me at the moment. And again, it's the experiment. When people are saying in the comments they want to know about what songs.
Definitely. That's all anyone's thinking about.
They just switched off. They ain't listening anymore. Maybe I'll put a little song list in the recovery community group.
Yeah, give us a poll. Give a poll and we can guess. Come join our membership community and find out if Sarah tells us after all.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Were there any last comments in there that we want to hit?
I think just when you mentioned resistance, Melissa asked the question about what do we do about that resistance?
I think it's recognizing it because it's not a mental thought. I think it's a feeling of resistance, recognizing that we're in it. And then giving yourself permission to, I think the whole theory for me comes into play a lot because it's like, oh, that's why I'm feeling resistance, because this doesn't feel safe to come out of it. But nothing bad is going to happen to me if I come out of it. If I soothe that will be okay. I have to remind my body of that, not necessarily my mind, which would be like, yeah, of course. But my body's like, what? You know?
How do you remind your body?
It's taken me a really long time and sometimes I forget. So it's been a practice of like just becoming aware. And then when I do, I sort of have a visual. I'm very visual. And so I picture my body in gears. And so when I'm at that vigilant gear, I picture like like taking it like down gear a little. And everything sort of just like moves slower. I'm picturing like everything just like flowing a little bit slower. And that makes me calm and feel like, okay, yeah, that's right. It's safe to do that. So I visualize. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks to our community. Thanks to Sarah. Thanks, God.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you to Instagram for bringing us together all that time ago.